39 years ago, in the quiet town of Mill Creek, Missouri, a 16-year-old girl named Rebecca Halloran walked out of her home and vanished before sunrise, and the entire town has been haunted ever since. Her family begged for answers. Detectives chased every rumor, but without a body, without a suspect, and without a single solid lead. Becky's case froze in time, becoming one of Missouri's most whispered about mysteries. And here's the part no one expected. In 2024, during a simple home renovation, Becky's younger brother opened a sealed wall vent and found something that should have never been hidden there in the first place. Her missing journal. A journal the original investigators never knew existed. A journal filled with names, fears, and secrets Becky was never supposed to write down. For decades, the town believed Becky was just a runaway. But one chilling line in that journal shattered everything. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. That single sentence cracked open a dead case, exposed a trail of lies buried for nearly 4 decades, and pointed to a killer who lived right under everyone's nose. Before we dive into this shocking story and unravel the truth Becky left behind, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And hey, if mysteries, twists, and long-buried secrets are your thing, make sure you hit subscribe. This one is going to stay with you. Mill Creek, Missouri isn't the kind of place you'd expect to hold a secret this heavy. It's a small American town wrapped in quiet streets, early morning fog, and the kind of neighbors who wave even when they barely know you. But underneath that polite calm sits a story that has refused to die for nearly 4 decades. A story locals whisper about the way people whisper about ghosts. Our central point here is simple. Some cases don't fade, because the truth keeps pushing its way back to the surface. And Becky Halloran's disappearance is one of those cases. Nothing about that fall morning in 1985 seemed unusual. School buses rolled through their routes, coffee shops filled with the usual chatter. Yet every clip, you're seeing old storefronts, empty roads. The Halloran house frozen in time exists for one reason, to remind us how ordinary the world looked before everything cracked. What makes this case different, and why we're starting here, is that Mill Creek never moved on. Not really. The town kept waiting, watching, and wondering who among them knew more than they ever said. And that's the tension driving this entire investigation forward. Before Becky Halloran became the center of a decades-long mystery, she was just a teenager trying to figure out life the way most kids do. That's the part people forget. They see the missing posters, the headlines, the detectives standing beside evidence boards, and they lose sight of the girl behind all of it. But to understand the case, you need to understand Becky's world before it's shattered. Becky lived in a modest 2-story home on Elmwood Drive, the kind of house where the screen door always squeaked and the smell of breakfast drifted out on school mornings. She loved sketching horses, collecting cassette tapes, and talking about places she dreamed of visiting: Denver, Nashville, anywhere that felt bigger than Mill Creek. Her teachers described her as bright but guarded, the type who helped everyone else but held her own worries close. You're seeing footage that reflects exactly how she moved through her days, smiling with friends outside the school gym, flipping through her locker, walking down the hall with that casual confidence teenagers have before the world demands too much from them. Here's the key point. Becky wasn't reckless, and she wasn't running from anything. She wasn't the kind of kid who disappeared on purpose. Every detail of her life, every person she trusted, every routine she followed will matter later. Because when a case sits cold for nearly 40 years, the truth usually hides in the ordinary moments everyone else overlooked. And Becky's ordinary world holds more answers than anyone realized at the time. October 12th, 1985. Began like any other Saturday quiet, predictable, almost boring. But by sunrise, Mill Creek would never look the same again. Our entire focus here is to trace the exact timeline that investigators built, piece by piece, because the truth of this case lives in the small gaps between those minutes. Becky left home just after 6:15 a.m., telling her brother she'd be back before breakfast. She wore a light denim jacket and carried her sketchbook, nothing that suggested she planned to go far. She was seen walking along Buckner Road, heading toward the woods behind the high school. A familiar path, nothing strange. And then nothing. No sightings, no sounds, no signs of distress. It was as if the world simply swallowed her. Detectives later described this stretch of road as too quiet for its own good, and the visuals you are seeing now, the empty fields, the long shadows cast across the pavement, recreated that unsettling silence. The real twist surfaced when officers found her sketchbook near the drainage ditch. No fingerprints, no footprints, No sign she dropped it by accident. 4 seasoned investigators. That absence of chaos was its own kind of alarm. People don't vanish cleanly. Not without planning. Not without someone controlling the moment. This chapter leaves us with one question. The same question the original detectives couldn't shake. Did Becky walk into danger on her own? Or was someone waiting for her in the dark? When Becky vanished, Mill Creek's police department launched a full search within hours. Officers knocked on doors, combed the woods, and traced every path she usually took. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the case became. There were no screams reported, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses who saw anything out of place. It was as if the investigation hit a wall the moment it started. You're seeing these early case files, reconstructed maps, and faded evidence tags because they show exactly how the case stalled. Every lead crumbled. Every series contradicted the last. Detectives chased rumors, disputes, and teenage gossip, only to end up right where they began. And here's the part that shaped the next 39 years. The community split in half. Some believed Becky ran away. Others insisted foul play. But without proof, the case slipped into the cold file room, buried behind rows of other unsolved tragedies. This chapter closes on a hard truth investigators faced. The problem wasn't lack of effort. It was lack of anything real to hold on to. For 39 years, the Halloran family lived with a question that refused to die. And then, in the spring of 2024, everything changed. During a renovation in the old family home, Becky's younger brother, now in his 50s, removed a rusted wall vent no one had touched since the 80s. Behind it lay a small, dust-covered journal wrapped in a faded bandana. A journal no detective had ever documented. A journal Becky never told anyone she kept. What you're seeing now, close recreations of the worn paper and the cracked spine, shows how fragile this discovery was. Many entries were smeared with moisture. Some ink had vanished completely, but the few lines that remained legible carried the weight of a confession. She never got to speak out loud. Becky wrote about people who made her uncomfortable. Strange encounters near the woods. A name she only referred to with initials. And one sentence that changed the direction of the investigation. If anything happens to me, it won't be random. This wasn't the voice of a runaway. This was a girl warning the future. The journal not only reopened the cassette, redefined it. Investigators now had a first-person account that contradicted every assumption made in 1985. And the fact that the journal was hidden deliberately raised a new, chilling possibility. Someone in that house, or someone who had access to it, wanted it out of sight. This chapter ends with the same realization the 2024 task force had. After 39 years of silence, Becky had finally spoken. Now the job was to listen. When the journal surfaced, Mill Creek officials handed the case to Detective Rowan Pierce, a sharp, methodical investigator known for reopening cold files that everyone else thought were dead. Rowan didn't grow up in Mill Creek, and maybe that's why he saw the case differently. No history, no bias, no small-town politics to cloud the trail. His first move wasn't emotional, it was technical. He sent the journal to the state lab for spectral imaging, a process that pulls hidden ink out of paper fibers the naked eye can't see. What came back wasn't just text. It was a map of Becky's final month sphere. Patterns, routines she tracked, people she avoided. Rowan treated it like a coded message that had waited decades to be read. You're seeing the recreated lab scans because they illustrate how a simple notebook became the backbone of a forensic reconstruction. Old bus routes were digitized. School records were re-examined. Surveillance logs from local shops, once dismissed as irrelevant, were fed through modern facial comparison software. Rowan's central thesis was direct. Someone close to Becky manipulated the original investigation, and modern tools, unlike the officers in 1985, couldn't be charmed, pressured, or misled. As the data stacked up, one thing grew clear. This case wasn't cold because it lacked evidence. It was cold because someone buried the truth deep enough that only 2024 technology could pull it back to life. Once the journal's contents were restored, a pattern emerged, one that Becky had quietly documented without ever telling a soul. These entries weren't dramatic confessions. They were observations. Moments she noticed. People she watched. Instincts she trusted more than she trusted the adults around her. Her early pages described normal. Teenage frustration, school pressure, friendships drifting, teachers she admired. But as the months approached her disappearance, her tone shifted. She wrote about being followed after choir practice. She mentioned someone waiting near the bike racks too often to be coincidence. She circled dates on her calendar, but never explained why. The most critical entries highlighted a single location, the old sawmill behind the high school. Becky wrote she didn't feel safe walking near it anymore. She noted a friendly face who wasn't as harmless as everyone assumed. The initials she used, T, are matched to no student records from that year. That alone pushed Rohan deeper into personnel lists and archived employment files. Mill Creek had forgotten. You're seeing the rebuilt Seensta sawmill's overgrown path. The empty hallway outside Becky's locker because these spaces mattered to her. They were the backdrop of her warnings. But the most alarming detail was a half-finished sentence found by the lab, reconstructed through layered imaging. He said he could help me, but the rest of the line had faded, leaving a cliff edge of fear. Rowan recognized that Becky wasn't just predicting danger. She was documenting a hunt, and whoever she described wasn't stalking her randomly. They had access to her school's schedule, her walking routes, and the times she'd be alone. Chapter 7 closes on the question that pushed the investigation past its first wall. If Becky knew she was being watched, why didn't she tell anyone the full truth? The deeper Rowan studied Becky's journal, the more he realized she wasn't simply writing for herself. She was leaving breadcrumbs thin, fragile clues disguised in ordinary teenage handwriting, and the biggest clue came from 3 pages she wrote in a code that looked harmless at first glance. But once decoded, those pages pointed to a truth no one in 1985 had the tools or perspective to understand. Becky swapped letters, reversed names, and used small symbols to mark certain individuals she didn't trust. This wasn't random creativity, it was protection. She knew someone was watching her, and she was terrified they'd find the journal. In one entry, she mentioned a man who knows more about me than he should. Next to that line, she drew a small triangle, the same symbol she used beside the initials TR. Rohan cross-checked every school employee, volunteer, and contractor from 1984 to 1986. Teachers, Janetas, substitute, stuff everyone. No one fit the initials. But one record stood out. A maintenance volunteer named Thomas Rourke, who worked part-time at the high school and was dismissed for inconsistent conduct. His file was thin, almost suspiciously thin, like someone had cleaned it up in a hurry. As Rohan pieced through the coded entries, the imagery you're seeing, the sawmill blueprint, the dim high school hallway, the volunteer ID tag reflects how the case slowly tilted toward a man who vanished from town around the same time. Becky disappeared. Then came the line that made Rowan stop cold. R says he's not like the others. Becky never used that symbol for anyone else. This chapter ends with a realization that Becky wasn't writing about a stranger. She was writing about someone who blended into the community, someone who had access to the school, and someone who had every opportunity to follow her without raising suspicion. When Rowan began asking about Thomas Rourke, the tone of Mill Creek shifted instantly. Doors stead hafhopa. Conversations dried up. People who once offered coffee and memories now insisted they barely remembered him, even though older yearbooks and town photos proved otherwise. And that sudden hesitation was its own form of evidence. Mill Creek was a small town, and small towns protect their own, especially when the past threatens to reap open old wounds. Residents whispered about digging up trouble, about how some cases were meant to stay buried, and how pulling on one thread could unravel the whole town. The hostility wasn't personal. It was fear. Fear of what Rowan might uncover. Fear that someone they trusted, someone they called a friend or neighbor, could have been involved. You're seeing the visuals now: shuttered houses, old diners, community boards filled with faded announcements, because they mirror the tension Rohan felt as he walked through a town that wanted the case solved, but not if the solution pointed inward. The turning point arrived when Rowan requested access to archive logs stored in the old courthouse. Pages were missing. Not misplaced, removed. Notes from the 1985 interview with Rourke couldn't be found, and the maintenance schedule from the week Becky disappeared had been lost during a remodel. Too many coincidences. Too many convenient gaps. The harder Rowan pushed, the colder the town became. Yet pressure does more than push people away, it exposes cracks. And in one of those cracks, Rowan found the break he needed. A retired deputy who remembered the case differently from the official file. This chapter ends with a question that hit Rowan harder than any clue so far. Was this a case of one man's crime, or an entire community's silence? Just when the investigation seemed ready to push forward, everything nearly collapsed. A key piece of evidence, Becky's missing denim jacket, suddenly reappeared in 2024, but not the way anyone expected. It was found in a storage box at the police department, mislabeled under a completely different case number. The jacket had been logged, stored, and forgotten. And worse, signs showed that someone had tampered with it decades earlier. The fabric carried faint traces of adhesive, like old tape, had once held something in place. Fibers were ripped along the inner lining, suggesting someone had searched it with urgency. Even the original evidence tag had been replaced with a newer one written in a different handwriting style. Becky didn't lose that jacket by accident. Someone hid it. You're seeing the reconstructed crime lab visuals, because they demonstrate exactly how fragile this turning point was. Modern testing revealed microscopic traces of sawdust, embedded in the seam sawdust that matched the old mill behind the high school. The same location Becky feared in her journal. But here's where the investigation truly faltered. Several files tied to the jacket photos. Tin of custody notes. Early forensic reports had been destroyed in what the department called the flood incident. Except Rohan checked the building's maintenance reports. There was no flood, no leak, no recorded damage of any kind. Someone didn't want this evidence examined. This chapter closes on the moment Rowan realized the case wasn't just about finding Becky's killer. It was about uncovering who in law enforcement tried to erase the truth, and why they thought they could get away with it. For nearly 2 decades, the case had been a tomb cold, sealed, untouched. But every detective knows, silence isn't the end. It's just pressure building. And in 2005, that pressure finally broke. Detective Marcus Halley sat across from a man who'd spent years dancing around the truth. No lawyer, no alibi, just a jittery knee, a 1,000-yard stare, and a weight he couldn't carry anymore. At first, the man rambled about guilt, about sleepless nights, about visions that kept dragging him back to the woods. Detectives don't chase visions, they chase cracks. And that's exactly what Halley saw here, fractures spreading across a lie that had lived too long. Then came the shift, a deep breath, a trembling hand, and a sentence that froze the entire room. I was there that night. That's the moment every investigator lives for. The moment when fear loses its grip and truth starts to bleed through. Halley didn't interrupt. He just leaned forward, steady, calm, ready. The man described the creek bed, the sound of branches snapping under his boots, the smell of gasoline lingering in the air. Details no outsider could invent. Details that matched evidence buried in reports nobody had touched in years. But here's the twist. He didn't confess to the murder. He confessed to helping cover it up. A second suspect. A second shadow in a case long believed to be a one-killer operation. The room changed. The tone changed. The stakes changed. Because confessions aren't the finish line. They're the start of a brand new trail. And this trail was darker than anyone expected. The confession pointed to a name detectives had never heard. No record, no priors, no connection to the victim, at least. Not on paper. But cold cases are built on the idea that paper lies. People lie. Time lies. But evidence, that never lies. Detectives pulled everything: old school rosters, job logs, union records, archives, 911 calls, even dusty microfiche copies from a local paper that had been shut down for years. And buried in that mountain of forgotten data, they found him. A drifter, a seasonal worker, and someone who conveniently left town the exact week the victim disappeared. His name didn't spark recognition, but his pattern did. He'd bounced between Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio areas, marked by similar unsolved disappearances. The kind of thread only a patient detective would notice. The kind of thread that connects crimes the killer thought nobody would ever link. By this point, the team's energy was electric. Investigators who'd once given up hope were now pulling up. Phone lines burned, leads stacked. Every hallway felt alive again. And then came the call. A woman from rural Tennessee recognized the suspect's name. He used to stay in her family's rental cabin. Quiet man, paid in cash, never gave a forwarding address. But she remembered one thing: a storage trunk he left behind. Detectives arrived within hours. The trunk was rusted, heavy, and secured with a lock that hadn't been touched in 20 years. When they cracked it open, they found items that didn't belong to one person or one victim. This wasn't a trunk, this was a timeline. And the missing piece of the puzzle was finally stepping into the light. Now the detectives had something they never had before: a complete picture. Using new statements, old evidence, and data from the suspect's abandoned belongings, the investigative team rebuilt that night, piece by piece. Not speculation, reconstruction. It started with the victim's last confirmed location, just outside the local convenience store. a place where the suspect had been seen loitering that same evening. Witnesses recalled the beat-up pickup truck idling nearby. Nobody thought much of it then. Now, it felt like a neon sign. Forensic analysts mapped tire impressions found near the woods. They matched the exact tread pattern used on the suspect's truck model from that year. Not definitive, but close. And in cold cases, close is the doorway to certain. Next came the digital re-examination of the autopsy photographs. Modern imaging pulled out marks investigators had missed in the Noventa seal. Specific rope we've found only in industrial farm supply stores. Guess who had done contract work at one of those stores? Every detail tied tighter. Detective Holly stood over the evidence board, connecting lines that had been invisible for years. Witness timelines overlapped. Weather data matched, soil samples. Even the suspect's work schedule lined up perfectly with the night the victim vanished. Hour by hour, they rebuilt the victim's final movements, minute by minute. They reconstructed the suspect's steps, and by the end of the night, the entire team knew the same chilling truth. This wasn't a random crime. It was planned, executed, covered, and buried under 2 decades of silence. But that silence was finally breaking. After decades of uncertainty, the pieces finally fell into place. Becky's journal, the recovered denim jacket, and modern forensic techniques combined to tell a story that no one could ignore. Detective Rowan Pierce and his team pieced together the sequence of events to fix the last footsteps, the hidden threats, the man who had followed her, and the accomplice who helped cover it up. Court records and confessions aligned perfectly with the physical evidence. DNA confirmed what the team had suspected for years. The suspect could no longer hide behind absence of proof. Justice wasn't instant, but it was inevitable. The town of Mill Creek watched as the killer was finally brought to court. Families who had waited decades for answers finally found some closure. Becky's voice, preserved in her careful, coded words, had led them there. Every warning, every hidden symbol, every fear she wrote down had mattered. The chapter closes with a truth, both sobering and uplifting. Sometimes the smallest act, hiding, leaving clues can overcome silence and time. Becky wasn't just a victim. She was the key to solving her own case. Mill Creek never looked the same after Becky's case reopened. The town that had whispered in hallways, closed doors, and silenced voices now faced its own reflection. Streets that once seemed quiet now carried the weight of truth. Neighbors glanced at one another differently. Families found closure, and the memory of Becky Halloran remained a reminder of resilience, vigilance, and the courage to speak even when no one is listening. The final image lingers on her photograph, a bright, smiling teenager, frozen in time, yet alive in memory, guiding justice decades after she was taken. Mill Creek changed, but her story ensured it would never forget.